People who work at remote places. What creepy things have you noticed while at work? Story 1. I used to work at a Boy Scout summer camp. Every week, I had to take a large group of campers to a secluded spot for their wilderness survival badge, where they had to build a shelter out of sticks, leaves, and other natural materials and sleep in it overnight. The spot was only about half a mile from the main camp, but we took them on a winding route that made it feel much more remote. One night, all the campers had finished building their shelters, we had cooked dinner, and we were sitting around the campfire. It was getting late, around 11 o'clock, so I sent the campers to their shelters for the night and started cleaning up the fire. That's when we heard, in the distance, what sounded like church bells. They were faint, but my fellow staffers and I could hear them clearly. The bells continued for about 30 minutes, ringing roughly every 30 seconds. We were all a little creeped out, as there were no churches or towns within 20 miles. After the bells stopped, singing began. It was too faint to make out the words, but it sounded like a large church choir, full of energy and enthusiasm. By then, it was almost midnight. The singing went on for well over an hour, sometimes quiet, sometimes so loud it felt like it was getting closer. The campers were unnerved, but I told them there was a church service nearby and that there was nothing to worry about. Eventually, close to 1 o'clock in the morning, the singing stopped. A few days later, I learned that there had been a large KKK rally just a few miles away that night, and that was what we had heard. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Next story, I was serving as a fireman during my nation's compulsory national service. Once, we were called into the forest to retrieve a body found deep in the forest along one of the running trails. He had apparently ended his journey there and was discovered by a few morning joggers. What made it creepier was that we found a straw doll at the foot of the tree. Its head had several pins stuck in it, and there was a partially burned talisman nearby. We didn't touch the doll, leaving it for the authorities to handle. When we took the body down, we had to carry him several kilometers out of the forest. Halfway along the journey, a previously unnoticed wound on his face started bleeding. One of my men swore it was bleeding from the same spot where the bobby pin had been stuck in the doll. Though we couldn't confirm it, we had left the doll where the body was found for the police. We passed the body to the paramedics and made our way out of the area. Next story. I've worked in Canada's north for a few years now in oil and gas. It gets pretty creepy during night shifts when you realize a moose has been standing at the tree line, staring at you for who knows how long. Or when you find bear tracks crossing the path you just made 5 minutes earlier. Honestly, the silence of a snowy forest in the dead of night, hundreds of kilometers from anywhere, is unnerving. When your only contact with the outside world is a radio channel nobody is listening to, you feel incredibly alone. Next story. I do a lot of work out in the woods. The creepiest thing I've come across was finding some doves without heads. Nearby, I also saw sticks arranged in circles and paint on the trees. I am not sure if it was part of a ritual or not, but that's what I found. It could have just been wildlife or a cat catching the doves. That's totally possible. I've seen cats do that before. For context, the type of doves I found isn't native to this area. They might have escaped or been released and had a run-in with a hungry house cat. The painted circle of trees and sticks nearby could have been a coincidence. Who knows? I certainly don't know what really happened, so it's all speculation. Still, it's the weirdest and creepiest thing I've ever found. Next story. I work as a polar bear guard. That means I escort people across tundra and mountains and protect them from polar bears. Once, I saw a snowman totem with reindeer antlers sticking out of its head. It was deformed, full of bullet holes, and genuinely creepy. There was one time when I was planning to go to the gym at 6 in the morning because it was just the gym, I didn't bring a gun. Then I got an alert on my phone saying a bear was in the area, so I stayed in bed and ate Maltesers instead. It later turned out the bear was on my exact route to the gym at the exact time I would have been walking, dark, snowy, and completely exposed. I would have been an easy target. That was off duty though. On duty there haven't really been any close calls, just the occasional, hey look everyone, there's a bear way over there. Take a look through the binoculars and be a bit more alert. The rule is, if a bear is within 300 meters, I prepare to shoot. If it comes within 100 meters and heads toward me, that's when I would have to shoot. Regretfully, I don't want to shoot a bear, and so far, I haven't had to. I hope I never do. Next story. I worked in a store once in a really small town that was always dead, maybe a customer every hour or so. Most shifts were completely alone, which I am pretty sure wasn't even legal, but that was how it went. One dark evening, I was scrolling on my phone as usual when I heard the door open. I looked up and saw the back of a man walking down the first aisle toward the tinned foods. At first, I thought he was talking on the phone, so I went back to Reddit. Suddenly, I got this intense smell of soil and earth. I looked up again, and the man was approaching the counter. He was wearing overalls, and his hair was long and gray, and his clothes and body were covered in dirt. That's when I realized he wasn't on the phone at all. He was talking to himself in a bizarre, almost cartoonish tone, murmuring and letting out a weird, soft laugh. I froze. My first thought was that he might attack me. I didn't know what to do. Then, almost out of nowhere, a policeman stormed through the door. He asked if I was okay, and I couldn't even respond. The man was escorted outside, still murmuring words that made no sense, repeating legal over and over. That was the last I ever saw of him in the store. Later, I think I might have figured out who he was. There were rumors in town about a man who'd lost his mind, left his family, and had been squatting in an abandoned factory at the back of town. The police reportedly had to go there frequently to remove him. My friends and I once got inside through the roof, and it was unsettling. He had turned the place into a strange, chaotic space. Huge crosses carved into sheets hanging on the walls, a small plastic table with an ashtray, and hundreds of cigarette butts. There were feathers scattered around, like he had been collecting or handling birds. I don't know exactly what was going on, but it felt eerie. We didn't stay long. Nobody in town really knew who he was, and I can say for sure that the man in the store was the same person. But that night, standing behind the counter while he wandered around muttering to himself, was easily the creepiest encounter I've ever had. Even now, thinking back on it gives me chills. Next story. I spent a summer doing conservation work out in the absolute middle of nowhere in Wyoming. I was part of a crew that would spend 2 weeks camping in remote places to do manual labor where machines couldn't reach. This time, we were building new hiking and biking trails in the back portion of a designated wilderness area in a high-altitude desert. The nearest civilization was a 2-hour drive to a town of 41 people in sandy soil where tracks last forever. It was the middle of our stint, early at night, and everyone else had gone to bed. I stayed up to read, maybe around 11:30. It was pitch black outside, clouds covering the stars. My headlamp was probably the only light for 40 miles. Suddenly, I heard footsteps walking around our camp and heading toward the tents from where I was in the community tent. My adrenaline spiked instantly. 2 things seemed wrong. The person wasn't using a light, and the footsteps weren't coming toward me from the tents. They were coming from the opposite direction. Within 4 seconds, I dropped my book, got up, and turned the corner of the tent to cast my light on the sleeping tents. The sound had stopped, but I saw tracks in the dirt. They looked like someone had come from one end of camp, peered into my tent, walked through the sleeping tents, and continued out of camp. I don't know if I was making too much noise by walking around, but the rest of my crew woke up and asked what was going on. After I explained, they got up to inspect the boot prints. They were almost perfect copies of my own boots, except for one small detail. I had a rock stuck in my treads that disrupted the symmetry. I wore common work boots, but in US size 15 double wide, so there was no way these were someone else's. None of us slept much that night. We never saw or heard anything more. A light rain removed the tracks a couple of days later, but I remember none of us were willing to step on them. We carefully stepped over them like cracks in the sidewalk. Next story. Some friends and I were fishing a small pond just after dark for catfish. We started hearing sounds coming off the water like someone was throwing softball-sized rocks, but the noises seemed to come from all over the pond. We thought someone was messing with us and called out a few times for them to stop, but eventually we got freaked out and left. A few years later, I was fishing a different pond and heard the same sound. It turned out to be a beaver slapping its tail on the water to drive me from its territory. When beavers become a problem in rivers, they often relocate them to ponds in town. Next story. I lived up north for a while on a 3-year job. One night, a local took me into the woods because he swore that at midnight, at a certain spot, you could see a ghostly carriage where some people had frozen to death. Obviously, I expected to see nothing. We sat in absolute pitch-black darkness. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face or anything around you. The sky was slightly gray from thin clouds reflecting distant lights, but that was it. You couldn't even make out the tree line. We never saw a carriage or anything. Around 12:20, we were just smoking and chatting, thinking about leaving, when we heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking through the underbrush, loud crackling of breaking sticks and branches. Everything was still black. It got closer and louder, but we didn't see anyone. Nothing. And all we could think was how dangerous it was to be in these woods at night. A stick in the eye, a twisted ankle, a fall off a ledge. The ground is uneven and unforgiving. But it was definitely someone or something coming. There was a definite cracking and snapping sounds. In the pitch black, we drove the heck out of there. We weren't afraid of a ghost. We were afraid of a person insane enough to march through the woods without a light. I did not want to meet that guy. And when I say up north, imagine a place where you literally have to drive 3 hours to reach the closest city and another 3 hours to the next one. The noise wasn't squirrels. It was rhythmic, large branches snapping. I'd been there long enough to know what a possum sounds like. At that size, it could have been a bear. But bears wandering at night like that is unusual, which made it worse. Moose, possibly, but they're scarier than bears. The size of trucks, with antlers they'll use on anything that gets too close, and they vanish into the woods like ghosts. But we didn't hear hooves, so that wasn't it. Next story. I used to teach outdoor education, which was basically summer camp during the school year. School groups would come up and spend a few days at the camp. On their last night, we always told them a scary story around the campfire. It was the same story every time. We worked in pairs, so there were always 2 staff members for every school group. One staff member would tell the story, and the other would hide in the forest and make scary noises. As I told the story, every few minutes there would be a snap of a twig or rustling in the bushes. Of course, the kids would get freaked out, which was the whole point. It was really fun. Well, as I was walking around the campfire, looking at the kids' faces, I noticed a familiar one. My partner, Eric, sitting there smiling at me, wondering why I was staring. My heart had never started beating so fast in my life. I sped through the story, the kids left, and I finally explained to Eric that I thought it was him in the woods. His eyes went wide, and he said, "Are you telling me that wasn't one of the staff members?" So we both ran back to the main road. Next story. I used to be a supervisor for a janitorial company, and a couple of times a week, I had to go to a middle school to clean the hallway floors and gymnasium with a Zamboni-type vehicle that mopped and scrubbed the floors. I had the whole school to myself while I worked. I usually finished quickly and went to the library to read while eating my dinner. One morning after a shift, I got a call from school security asking me to come in. When I arrived, there was a police car, too. Uh-oh. They asked me a few questions like, "Did you notice anything out of the ordinary or strange while you were here last night?" No, I hadn't. I usually had headphones in. Security then showed me camera footage of someone breaking into one of the classrooms while I was riding the Zamboni not far away. I was there for another 2 hours. Nothing was stolen. The worst part? They didn't have footage of the person leaving. They didn't go out the way they came in, and the police had to sweep the entire school. We never found out what happened with that one. Next story. We were wrapping up for the day in northern Canada. I was fueling up the side boom all by myself. I had told the laborers I would take care of the rest because I was tired of listening to them whine about the cold. It was February, so pitch black. I kept hearing strange sounds, but the pump was too loud to make anything out. I searched around a couple of times and saw nothing. Then I got in the truck and drove past the front of the side boom, and there it was, a cougar sitting on top of a dirt pile about 15 feet away. The damn thing was just watching me, and it probably could have ended me without me even realizing it. I'd never seen a cougar in the wild before, and it's hard to understand just how big and powerful they are until you see one up close. That thing leaped off the 6-foot pile and probably didn't touch the ground for 15 to 20 feet. It's terrifying to think something so big and powerful could just be sitting there, deciding if it wants to make you dinner. Next story. I am a teacher at an urban public school and was at work late, grading and getting ready for the next day. Time had flown by, and before I knew it, it was 7 p.m. I started packing up to leave in a building that, in theory, was locked and empty, besides me, when our Alice alarm went off, indicating an armed intruder. I was alone, young, and terrified. I was absolutely not ready to fight a gunman over my lesson plans. I booked it out of the school, dove into my car, and peeled out of the parking lot, hearing the alarm blaring the whole time. In my rearview mirror, I could see the alarm lights still flashing and briefly debated never going back. Turns out they were doing routine maintenance and hadn't sent out an email to the teachers. Next story. As a biologist spending long stretches in remote areas, I've stumbled across more than a few unsettling sites. Meth labs are surprisingly common, usually hidden on absentee landowner property, often in rusted-out RVs. Then there are meth houses, decaying structures abandoned decades ago, but clearly reoccupied in the past few years, if not currently. Inside, I'd find scattered things, old corn, junk food wrappers, and worn mattresses dragged onto dusty floors, eerily reminiscent of the row houses in the Wire's Amsterdam. Colleagues of mine have even discovered bodies, mostly undocumented immigrants attempting to cross north, often victims of gun violence. I've walked areas with unsolved mysteries, and you learn quickly to tread lightly. There's a quieter sadness too, like the dozens of abandoned graveyards I've come across, their crumbling headstones often marking the short lives of children lost to early 20th century epidemics. It's a reminder of why we vaccinate. I've been shot at once, and on another occasion, I stumbled into a herd of feral hogs at night, hidden in tall cattails, easily more terrifying than any gator or snake. Pagan shrines show up occasionally, but are usually harmless. The strangest human moment? We made unforgettable eye contact with a man squatting over a 5-gallon bucket in his yard, deep in the swamp. Honestly, nature itself isn't all that creepy. It's the humans that add the real edge. Next story. I used to work in the Gulf of Mexico on oil rigs for years. It may not be exactly creepy, but I found it really unsettling. In deep open water, the water is incredibly clear, so you can see all the tuna and barracudas hanging around the rig, waiting for the onboard cook to throw off whatever food waste he has. Every once in a while, a huge great white shark would swim up from underneath and snatch a tuna. It takes less than a second. They're truly terrifying. I worked for a guy who spearfished underneath the rigs. He said it was perfect because there were tons of fish underneath, and the sharks would never go between the legs. They just waited for a fish to leave. Plus, the view was amazing, looking down and seeing nothing but the abyss. He loved it. I can only imagine how scared I would be. Next story. I used to be a delivery driver, which doesn't sound very remote, but I did have to deliver to some pretty isolated places. One time, I delivered to a trailer park barely inside our designated delivery zone. It was very dark and poorly lit. I left my car running with the headlights and interior lights on while delivering the pizza. When I returned to my car and sat down, I looked up and saw a creepy old man standing less than 3 feet from my side of the car, just staring. It was the equivalent of a jump scare. I started driving forward and had to do a U-turn to get out of the park. When I turned around, he was standing in the middle of the road. I freaked out for a second before speeding around him and watched him attempt to chase my car out of the park. I put in my 2 weeks after that. I also used to deliver for a supermarket in the UK. Many of our customers were in the middle of nowhere. My last delivery of the night was to a new customer I'd never been to before. I was already running late, trying to find this house at 10:30 p.m., even though my shift was supposed to end at 10. I was driving along the narrowest of country roads, surrounded only by dark fields and hedgerows, looking for any driveway. I hadn't seen another car or person for miles. Then I heard a loud thud on the side of my van, like something had been thrown at it. There were no trees or anything else around for something to fall from, and it hit the side of the van. I looked around, but there was nothing. Then it happened again, another thud. I drove back to the supermarket as fast as I could and told my manager I couldn't find the house. I had spent 30 minutes looking, and there was no house at the listed address or postcode. If there had been a house, they would have complained about not receiving their delivery. The weird part, they had to place the order and pay first, and the shop had a minimum delivery spend of £60 at the time. If this was a prank, it was an expensive one. Also, the only place someone could have hidden for the hour I spent trying to find the address was within or behind a hedgerow in freezing cold weather. Next story, I live on a ranch off a quiet dirt road. Our nearest neighbors are about a mile away as the crow flies, and they've had issues with people stealing things from their outbuildings and sheds. It was late in the year, so it was getting dark around 6 p.m. Every time I saw headlights down our road, I'd watch to make sure they weren't stopping on the property. One evening, I saw a vehicle moving very slowly down the road, stopping at the end of our driveway about 120 yards from our front porch. It was parked right in front of a 1960s pickup I have, so I thought whoever it was might be looking to steal it or just surveying the property. I put on a black coat and grabbed my rifle to investigate, staying out of the headlights as I approached. I could tell it was a white van, but nothing else distinguished it. When I was about 50 yards away, the van backed up and turned into our driveway. I froze as the headlights washed across me, standing in the middle of the driveway, and saw the reflective FedEx logos on the side of the van. Needless to say, the FedEx driver probably pooped his pants when he saw a dark figure standing in the middle of a field at night, holding a rifle. After I tried a friendly wave and smile, he continued up the driveway to the house. I explained the situation, and we both had a good laugh. That's how I got to be the creepy guy in some FedEx delivery driver story. Next story. Working on ships has its moments. One night, I was sailing through Alaskan waters, and it happened to be my first time seeing the northern lights. I couldn't believe how amazing it was. The sky was so bright it almost looked like dusk, and we could see clearly for miles. A few buddies and I went up to the roof, or what we call the Lido deck, around 1 a.m. just to gaze at it. An hour or so in, there were 6 of us up there, nearly the entire crew. Suddenly, a big white spotlight shone on us. We were near land, but the light was above the water and high enough that it couldn't have come from a ship. It illuminated us for about 15 to 20 seconds. When the light turned off, we looked for its source. There was nothing, no trace of an aircraft or anything. A couple of minutes later, the same thing happened, this time on the other side of our vessel, above the mountains. Again, we saw nothing. We had never seen any aircraft hovering over these waters, especially at 2 a.m. We don't know what it was. Our best guess is some sort of silenced military aircraft doing drills. Still, it was one of the strangest things I've experienced out on the ocean. Next story. I spent a summer in Wyoming collecting data on bats and herpetofauna in remote locations, including Bureau of Land Management land. I heard a lot of weird noises, mountain lions screaming, deer snorting, and what sounded like owls fighting. One morning, I woke up to find 2 bull moose sleeping about 20 yards behind my tent. All of this felt like part of the job. Until one night, a truck started driving toward us while we were on a Bureau of Land Management square in the southwestern part of the state. There was no road, it was going overland, and it slowly approached us. It stopped about 100 yards away, turned off the lights, and we could see a person get out. They walked a full circle around us at a distance of 100 yards, then got back in the truck and drove off in the opposite direction. This was after dark, and the shadowy figure circled us completely. You could hear them moving through the sagebrush, and I am sure they could hear us talking. We packed up after that and drove to a hotel an hour away. I called the office and told them I was taking a gun next time. I didn't feel safe relying on bear mace as our only defense. Next story, I work on North Sea oil rigs off the coast of Scotland on an ad hoc basis. Nothing I've experienced is paranormal, but the place can feel very unsettling and strange. Fog can roll in out of nowhere, and other rigs you can see off to the sides can vanish right before your eyes. Sometimes you can see the walkways 6 feet in front of you, or if you're walking over grating, you can see the sea below. About 60 meters down from the deck, though you can hear it, muffled. Fog can appear in just a few minutes, turning a perfectly clear day into pea soup. You can also feel the rig moving or swaying in high winds and rough seas. Even though it's a fixed-leg platform, it's unnerving to feel your office swaying when it shouldn't be. My last trip was my first night shift, and it was particularly eerie. The plant has a constant background hum, but I walked around the whole rig without seeing another living soul for the entire shift. Usually, there are about 130 people on board. Those smaller rigs have smaller crews. Once in a while, I get this sudden awareness of just how isolated you are. Most rigs I've worked on are about an hour's chopper ride from land. If anything goes wrong, it can escalate very quickly. Next story. I used to work as an alligator hunting guide for trophy hunters during my summers south of New Orleans. Spending sunup to sundown deep in the heart of Cajun swamp territory left me seeing some weird and creepy things. The first one that comes to mind is when I saw what my hunting partner called the loup-garou. I would have called it a chupacabra, but that's because I am a native of the Southwest, not the South. We were riding through a narrow area deep in the swamp, looking for signs of a big gator. The banks were close on both sides of the boat. There was barely enough water for us to push ahead. But those mud boats are impressive and can practically run on dry land, so we pressed on. Suddenly, I saw a gray flash in the trees out of the corner of my eye. It made me nervous. Swamp deer are small and shy. There aren't many mammals that want to hang out in thick undergrowth, knee-deep mud, and hidden gators. I tapped my partner's shoulder to catch his attention over the motor's noise and pointed in the direction I saw the flash. He cut the motor and asked if it was a gator slide. I shook my head and said I had no idea what it was, but I had seen something. Then, the creature stepped out from the trees. It was big, on all fours, with mottled gray skin. Its movements were janky and jerky. It had a canine-like face, and when it locked eyes with me, I felt sick to my stomach. My partner immediately started the motor, and we reversed out as fast as we could. My rational brain said, "Poor creature with mange, either a massive coyote or maybe a wild dog." My primal brain was screaming, "Monster, run or die." Even knowing what it probably was, it was a freaky experience I'll never forget. Next story. During college, which was located far from major cities, the woods surrounded us. One of the most highly rated trails, the Loyal Sock Trail, was about an hour's drive from the university. I invited a friend to come along, as he had never been on an extended backpacking trip. Our plan was to tackle the 50-plus-mile trail over a 4-day weekend. I am an Eagle Scout and had spent countless hours in the woods, so I was used to minor spooky things, coyote howls, raccoons in the middle of the night, even the occasional unknown noise. The scariest thing in the woods, however, is people. We were about 20 miles into the trail. Pennsylvania's dense underbrush and trees line the paths closely, so I usually hike about 100 meters off the trail to avoid disturbing anyone or being disturbed myself. Following that strategy, my friend and I set up camp in an amazing spot on a peninsula where a creek met a river. There was only one way in and one way out. We made a fire, cooked our food, drank a little, then put the fire out around midnight and went to our tents. The night was quiet. Fall leaves crunched underfoot. The moon shone through the bare trees, and the air was cool. The only sound was my friend turning over in his sleep until I heard voices. They sounded very close, though they were still on the trail over 100 meters away. I checked my watch. 3 a.m. Who hikes at 3 a.m., 20 miles into a trail? I slowly unzipped my tent, and my friend did the same, signaling for silence and frantically pointing toward the trail. Then we saw them. 4 adults, 3 men, and 1 woman walking directly toward our camp. They had no lights. Only one had a backpack, which made no sense for a long hike. My survival instincts kicked in. I grabbed my knife, feeling more exposed than ever. They walked into our sight and sat by our extinguished fire pit. My friend cautiously asked what they were doing. Without answering, they asked if we had any food. We had only a few extra MRE-style meals, which I handed to one of the men. I asked why they weren't using a light. They replied, in succession, 1. We don't use lights. 2. We know where the trail is. 3. It is better to hike late at night. Unnerved, my friend asked them to leave. Instead, they asked if we wanted to light the fire and hang out. We declined. They gathered their bag, got up, and walked off without another word. We kept watch in shifts, making sure they didn't return. Needless to say, we got very little sleep that night. When the sun rose, we finally rested, and by the afternoon it felt almost dreamlike. The only evidence they had been there was a fuzzy cap one of them must have dropped, which I still have. In the 8 years since, I have never returned to the Loyal Sock Trail. Nothing in the woods has ever felt as unsettling as that night. Next story. I don't usually spend time out in the woods, but my dad and I were hunting in the Poconos. It was freezing, and we were sitting in a hunting tower when we started hearing what sounded like an old religious chant, like a group singing in Latin while walking in formation. The sound kept getting closer, and then we saw movement about 20 meters ahead. A group of roughly 10 to 30 people appeared, all dressed in white and holding candles. Surrounding them were about 5 more people with rifles and shotguns, positioned in front, behind, and on the sides. We stayed completely still and let them pass, all while they stared directly at us. It was terrifying. About 10 minutes later, we went over to where they had been standing. The snow was pristine. There were 0 footprints. To this day, we have no idea what we saw that day. Next story. I worked in a salt mine under Lake Eerie a couple of years ago, and generally speaking, when things are brought down, they're never brought back up. It takes a lot of time to disassemble everything on the surface, secure and cover the parts, and put it back together underground, and vice versa. As a result, there are tons of old trucks, tractors, and countless other items lined up on the far side of the mine. Back in the 1980s, the University of Michigan and Cal Irvine were studying proton decay and trying to capture measurements when it happened. Conducting this experiment on the surface is problematic because of cosmic rays and other interference, so the mine was chosen, as 2,000 feet of earth absorbs nearly everything. They dug out a pool about 80 feet by 70 feet, filled it with roughly 2,640,000 gallons of purified water, and installed fancy cameras and equipment along the sides. There was also a full shop, lab, and dive center down there. I don't think they ever captured a proton decaying, and eventually the grant money ran out after a few years. The mine simply put up some caution tape on the main steel door leading to the study, and that was it. Fast forward 20 years, I am working there as an electrician and get a job fixing some large conveyor motor drives. I start cannibalizing parts from old equipment and remember one of the old-timers mentioning abandoned gear near the Kepi lift, the main elevator. I get there and find a big steel door falling off its hinges with old caution tape on the ground. The study had to be accessed through this single door, which was dug into the wall, so over time the earth had crushed and bent it. After several tries, I finally yank the door open and step inside, only to scare myself and stumble back when I see a full scuba outfit hanging 3 feet inside. I collect myself, confirm I didn't actually panic as badly as I thought, and step past the scuba suit. Everything inside had been left exactly as it was 20 years ago. Coffee cups, day planners, job schedules, tons of scuba gear, oxygen tanks, and computers. I make it about 10 feet to the edge of the pool. It's hard to see if the water's still there because it's perfectly still, but eventually I see it. 60-plus feet of pure water in total darkness, the sight of a huge black pool in a massive black hole in the ground, lit only by the small beam of my cap lamp and the absolute silence of being underground, made me very uncomfortable, so I left quickly. It's not particularly scary, but all that equipment sitting down there, nearly perfectly preserved in such an unexpected place, always felt creepy to me. Next story, not work-related. But while I was living in rural Australia, I went to a swimming hole with some friends. You had to walk down a rainforest trail from the road for about 20 minutes to reach it. When we got there, no other cars were parked near the trail, and we didn't see anyone else the entire time we were swimming. We were there in the late afternoon, and as the sun started to set, we made our way back to the car. By the time we reached the road, it was dark, and we were using our phones as flashlights. Parked right next to our car was an old camper van. The lights were off, and the side door was wide open, with no one inside. There was no one around that we could see, so we got spooked. quickly got into our car and started driving. A little way down the road, we saw headlights behind us. The road ends near the swimming hole, so it had to be the camper van following us. Thankfully, the lights turned down a side road before we reached the highway, and we didn't see them again. We still wanted to check the car boot when we got home. Next story, I used to do salmon spawning surveys, which meant walking along streams in fairly remote areas. Some of these streams are on timberland, and you really don't expect to see anyone out there. Being naturally cautious, I always try to stay aware of my surroundings and avoid encounters whenever possible. One survey location was close to a highway. To reach it, I parked at a pullout, followed the river downstream to a flagged trail, and hiked over a ridge to meet an old logging road on private timberland. I walked along the logging road for about 100 meters before veering off into the thick woods, dense second-growth forest that had grown back after logging. Eventually, the game trails led down to the stream. I came back in the spring to survey steelhead, but this stream was also used for other types of salmon in the fall. The game trails were marked with flags from previous surveyors, and multiple routes were marked, which made it confusing at times. Some trails just petered out once the vegetation got too thick, and one even ended at a cliff overlooking the riverbed. There were lots of faint trails, and it was easy to get disoriented if you weren't paying close attention. One day, I followed a set of survey flags along the hillside. The trail seemed recently disturbed, and I thought maybe a bear had passed through since my last visit 2 weeks earlier. It eventually led to a small, very secluded clearing. The area felt strangely quiet, almost unnatural. As I looked around the clearing, I noticed something off to the side. There was a large makeshift shelter about 50 to 75 feet away. It was surrounded by jugs and other containers, all arranged in a way that suggested someone had deliberately put them there. The lighting made it hard to see exactly what else was around, but I could tell there were more objects scattered nearby. The whole setup gave me an uneasy feeling. It didn't look like random trash. It felt intentional. Even though I couldn't see anyone, I felt like I was being watched. Every little sound, the wind, a bird in the trees, even the crunch of leaves under my feet, sounded amplified in the silence. My instincts screamed at me to leave immediately, so I turned around and carefully made my way back off the trail without trying to get closer. That day left me feeling tense and uneasy for hours. Even though nothing physically threatened me, the sense of isolation and the mysterious shelter stayed with me. It reminded me that in the woods, it's not always the wildlife that can make you feel uncomfortable. Sometimes, it's the signs of other people in places where they don't belong. Next story. Although it's not really work, I go hunting pretty far north in Canada. Where I hunt for deer, there are plenty of wolves, bears, and other wildlife, so I stay in a cabin up there. You aren't always on edge, but you want to bring a rifle with you anywhere, even if you don't plan on shooting anything. It was around 5 a.m. and I was on the four-wheeler, freezing and unsure whether to get to my tree stand before dawn or just stay put. I kept hearing crashing through the bushes, but I dismissed it as ice cracking from the previous night's snow. Creepy nonetheless. I reached my stand, climbed up, and settled in for the morning. I had a pretty good view of a field that had been cleared, and on the opposite end of the clearing was an old, burned-out cottage. As the sun rose behind my stand, the morning was very still, with only the occasional branch falling through the forest. The day passed without any shooting, and I eventually decided maybe I should check out the burned-down cabin. I had never bothered before, and my curiosity got the better of me. There wasn't a cleared trail, so I had to go on foot. I unloaded my rifle and set off for a long walk. About 10 minutes later, I got close and saw some old farm equipment, which made sense. A field in the middle of the forest was probably cleared for farming at some point. I approached the doorway, hearing only the crunch of snow under my feet. The doorway had somehow survived whatever had happened there. I stepped carefully through it, making sure not to disturb anything. Then I noticed strange shapes scattered across the floor, objects that looked like remnants of old equipment or maybe parts of past structures. The way they were arranged was odd, almost deliberate, and it gave me an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. I paused, took a step back, and realized I didn't want to be there any longer. Something about that cabin, The silence, the isolation, and the mystery of what had been left behind was enough to make me bolt across the field without looking back. I never did figure out why anyone had put those things there in the middle of the forest, and I didn't want to think about it. The next year, I moved my stand and made sure to avoid that area entirely. Next story, I used to do agricultural work, alone in a field for about 10 hours a day. The sheer number of times I heard the sound of running and snapped my head up to see literally nothing there was unnerving. For a while, I was convinced it had to be animals moving between the trees. The weirdest moment came when I heard it loudly from a row of trees right next to me. I immediately ducked under the branches to look, and I saw the feet of whatever was running by, except there was absolutely nothing there. I remember trying to stay calm, walking quickly to the toilet block, and sitting there for a long while before returning. I never thought I'd be so freaked out in the daytime, but there wasn't a soul nearby for quite a distance, and it really amplified my imagination. Next story, I spent some time in the peat swamp forests of Borneo studying wild orangutans. We would go into the forest very early, around 4 a.m. One morning, we came across a clouded leopard on the trail we used to enter the forest. It was just crouched there watching us. We shouted and tried to act big, and one of the indigenous people we worked with even took out his slingshot and shot rocks at it. He missed on purpose, just trying to scare it off. The leopard stayed there for about 5 minutes watching us, before slowly walking into the thick brush off the cleared trail. When we walked past, I shined my light where it had gone and could clearly see a pair of reflective eyes, only 3 meters away, crouched and watching us pass. It was creepy, but also incredibly cool to see one in person, especially considering how critically endangered they are. These were wild orangutans. We tried our best to keep our distance and never attempted to touch them. The goal was to observe them while minimizing any impact on their natural behavior. That said, over my year there, I was charged by one of the big dominant males on 3 separate occasions. He never touched me, but he sure scared the heck out of me and made me run. I am an American who studied biology in college. How I got this job was a combination of luck and preparation. I worked hard in college, gained field experience, and one day we had a guest speaker, a big name in orangutan conservation research, talk to us. I had always wanted to go to Borneo, and after the talk, I spoke with her and discovered she needed 2 students to do research for a year after graduation. She interviewed me, and the rest was history. I do want to mention to anyone considering this field that it is hard work. We would wake up at 3:30 a.m. and spend 14 to 15 hours in a swamp forest following wild orangutans, taking data every 2 minutes. It was hot and humid, and there were tons of mosquitoes. Communication with the outside world was limited, except on our days off when we could take a 15-minute walk to a tree stand and sometimes get 1 bar of service to send a few WhatsApp messages to family. The camp housed only about 15 people, and we would spend 2 to 4 months there at a time before returning to the city of Palangkaraya to bring back samples. The research location was in central Kalimantan, Borneo. That all being said, it was an amazing experience. I saw animals and insects that completely blew my mind, and I missed them all the time. Next story. I spent several seasons working at a remote field camp in Antarctica, over 1,000 kilometers from the main station in McMurdo. Every once in a while, a skua or Antarctic tern would accidentally end up following one of the small planes, like a twin otter, out to our camp. Once there, they'd basically be stranded with no way to get back to the coast. Some mornings, I'd step out of my tent and see a lonely tern circling overhead, knowing it was essentially a dead bird flying. It was quite eerie. Along these lines, when birds or seals die down there, the cold and dry conditions prevent their bodies from decaying. They essentially mummify. Outside McMurdo, at Scott's Discovery Hut, there is still a perfectly preserved seal carcass from 1912, sitting by the entrance. I think the birds follow the contrails more than the planes themselves, but I am not entirely sure. From what various camp managers and other scientists told me, once a tern or skua gets that far from the coast, they're basically toast due to the lack of food and extreme temperatures. I was in graduate school studying glaciology, paleoclimatology, and in some sense geophysics. I deployed as part of a big NSF grant to extract and study an ice core record. I actually returned in 2015 to the South Pole to work on that core as well. Last year, I deployed on a research ship off the coast of West Antarctica as part of an ocean sediment core team, which was also fascinating. You can get down there as a tourist, but it costs over $10,000. The most amazing place I visited was the area around Union Glacier, where we worked on remote seismic and GPS stations. We flew all over, landing on tiny, exposed rocks in the middle of nowhere. It was surreal. I watched the thing at least once a season, as is tradition. A little claim to fame. Technically, I was the first person to reach the South Pole in 2016. I went out to the marker at midnight on December 31st, 2015. This brings up the somewhat eerie thought that while at the South Pole, literally every other person, alive or dead, is north of you. While there, I also completed the first ever 50-mile running ultramarathon in minus 40 degrees Celsius temperatures. It was insanely stupid, but also kind of fun. I still do research, but now I mostly teach at a university and work with graduate students. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.